You've spent your entire life building a version of yourself that simply doesn't exist. A version meticulously crafted to please parents, friends, colleagues, partners, even strangers online. And the scariest part, you've done it so well, for so long, that you've completely forgotten who you really are. Eckhart Tolle calls this the greatest invisible prison of humanity. And today you're going to understand why breaking free from it can be the most liberating. And, simultaneously, the most terrifying experience of your life. If you've ever found yourself saying yes when you desperately wanted to say no, if you've ever smiled when you were seething with anger, if you've ever agreed with opinions that weren't your own, just to avoid conflict, then this video is going to resonate with you on a deep level. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just about stopping people-pleasing. It's about finally seeing the truth that your ego has hidden from you for years. Before we continue, I need you to understand something that Tolle explained in one of his most revealing lectures. He said that the need to please others isn't generosity. It isn't kindness. It isn't love. It's fear, disguised as virtue. It's the ego wearing a mask of humility to get what it really wants: approval, validation, and the temporary sensation that you are accepted. A study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology by Dr. Emily Carter and Dr. David Lee found that people who consistently prioritize the needs of others above their own experience significantly higher levels of anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. We're not talking about selfish people who occasionally help someone. We are talking about the people who seem the most generous, the most thoughtful, the most available. Exactly those people are destroying themselves from the inside out. Why does this happen? Tolle explains it in a way that will make immediate sense. He says that when you seek external approval, you are essentially telling the universe that you are not enough as you are, that you need the validation of others to exist. And that message, repeated thousands of times over the years, creates a deep wound in your relationship with yourself. You're probably wondering, but what's the difference between being kind and being a people-pleaser? The difference is crucial, and Tolle defines it clearly. True kindness comes from a place of wholeness. You give because you have to give. You help because you want to help. There's no expectation of return. There's no fear of rejection if you say no. The kindness of a people-pleaser, on the other hand, comes from a place of neediness. You give to receive. You help to be accepted. There's always an invisible transaction happening. Psychology researchers have identified that compulsive people-pleasing behavior is directly linked to childhood experiences. Dr. Sarah Johnson and Dr. Mark Williams in 1996 found that people with a history of rejection or abandonment in childhood were much more likely to develop patterns of people-pleasing as a way to prevent future rejections. In other words, when you were a child and your parents' love seemed conditional, you learned that you needed to behave in certain ways to be loved. But here comes the revelation that changes everything. Tolle points out that this childhood programming doesn't disappear when you become an adult. It simply transfers to all of your relationships. You continue trying to earn the love that you never received unconditionally. Only now you do it with bosses, with romantic partners, with friends, even with people you just met. The problem is that this strategy never really works. Because even when you get the approval you were seeking, it's never enough. There are always more people to please. There are always more situations where you need to mold yourself. And each time you mold yourself, you lose a little more of yourself. Tolle describes this as living in a constant state of fragmentation. You're not a whole person. You're a collection of different facades for different audiences. The facade of the obedient child, the facade of the dedicated employee, the facade of the always available friend, the facade of the perfect partner. And beneath all these facades, there's someone you barely know. Your authentic self. Now I'm going to share what happens when you finally stop trying to please everyone. And fair warning, it's not what most people expect. The first thing that happens is fear. Lots of fear. When you start saying no, when you start expressing your true opinions, When you stop molding yourself to please, your ego panics. It's been programmed to believe that rejection is equivalent to death. So, when you do something that could potentially cause rejection, your nervous system reacts as if you're in real danger. Tolle explains that this fear is actually a good sign. It means you're stepping outside of the ego's comfort zone. It means you're finally challenging the programming that's kept you trapped. The discomfort you feel isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something different. The second thing that happens is that some people will leave. This is painful, but necessary. Many of your relationships were built on a false version of you. When that false version disappears, those relationships no longer have a foundation. The people who only liked your facade won't like who you really are. And that's okay, because the space they leave will be filled by people who love you for real. The third thing that happens is completely unexpected. You start to see the truth, not just about yourself, but about everything. Tolle calls this the clarity that comes from authenticity. When you stop filtering reality through the lens of what will others think, you finally see things as they are. Suddenly you realize how many of your decisions were based on pleasing others, your career, your relationships, even your personal preferences. You start to question everything. Do I really like this? Or did I learn to like it to be accepted? Do I really want this? Or do I want it because others expect it? This process can be destabilizing at first. You may feel like you don't know who you are anymore, but Tolle assures us that this phase is temporary. It's the empty space between who you pretended to be and who you really are. And in that space, something new can be born. Remember when I talked about the research by Dr. Carter and Dr. Lee at the beginning? They also discovered something important. People who manage to establish healthy boundaries and stop compulsively prioritizing others experience significant reductions in anxiety and depression. We're not talking about becoming a selfish person. We're talking about becoming a whole person. Tolle offers a simple practice to begin this process. He suggests that before saying yes to any request, you take a pause. In this pause, guys, ask yourself, am I saying yes because I genuinely want to do this? Or am I saying yes out of fear of disappointing someone? If the answer is fear, you have a choice to make. You can continue feeding the pattern, or you can say no and face the discomfort that comes with it. This discomfort, according to Eckhart Tolle, is the price of freedom. It's the ego dissolving. It's the facade cracking. And you, being reborn as who you really are. There's a deeper dimension to this. That's rarely discussed. When you stop people-pleasing, you also stop lying, because every time you say yes when you want to say no, you are lying. Every time you smile when you're angry, you're lying. Every time you agree with something you don't believe in, you're lying. And these little lies, they accumulate. They create a distance between you and reality. They create a distance between you and others. And most importantly, they create a distance between you and yourself. When you finally stop lying, all that distance starts to disappear. You reconnect with the truth. And that reconnection is what Tolle calls awakening. Clinical psychology has an interesting term for compulsive people-pleasing: sociotropy. The American Psychological Association defines it as the tendency to place excessive value on relationships over personal independence. People who are highly sociotropic are more vulnerable to depression when they experience conflicts or losses in relationships. Why? Because their entire identity is built on the approval of others. Tolle goes even deeper when he explains that this dependence on approval is actually a form of slavery. You may appear free on the outside, but on the inside, you're constantly chained to the opinions of others. Every decision goes through the filter of, will they accept me? Every action is calculated to maximize approval and minimize rejection. That is not freedom. That's an invisible prison. The good news is, these walls can be torn down, and the first step is simply seeing them. Tolle emphasizes that awareness is the great dissolvent. When you bring conscious light to an unconscious pattern, It starts to lose power. You don't need to fight it. You just need to see it clearly. So the next time you catch yourself about to say yes when you want to say no, stop. Observe the fear that arises. Observe the voice in your head saying you're going to be rejected. Observe the impulse to mold yourself to please. And then, simply observe. Don't judge. Don't try to change. Just see. That act of seeing is transforming, because the moment you see the pattern, you're no longer completely identified with it. A space opens up between you and the automatic behavior. And in that space, a different choice becomes possible. Tolle says that many people who stop people-pleasing experience a period of mourning. They cry for the person they could never be. They cry for the years lost living for others. They cry for the authenticity they sacrificed on the altar of approval. This mourning is healthy. It's necessary. It's part of the process of becoming whole. But after the mourning comes something extraordinary. Comes the discovery of who you really are when no one is looking. Comes the freedom to express what you genuinely think and feel. Comes the peace of not needing to constantly manage the perceptions of others. There's a crucial difference between being seen and being approved of. Tolle explains that being seen is being recognized in your authenticity. It's when someone meets you as you really are. Being approved of, on the other hand, is when someone validates the facade you are wearing. Most people confuse approval with love, but approval is conditional. It depends on you continuing to do what pleases the other person. True love is unconditional. It exists regardless of whether you say yes or no. When you stop seeking approval, you open up space for true love to enter your life. Relationships built on authenticity instead of performance. Connections based on who you are instead of who you pretend to be. There's something that Tolle rarely mentions, but that's crucial to understand. People-pleasing isn't just a psychological problem, it's a spiritual problem. Because every time you deny your truth to please someone, you are betraying your own soul. You're saying that the opinion of another is more important than your own essence, and this repeated betrayal creates a deep spiritual wound. Many people who seek spiritual practices like meditation and mindfulness are actually trying to heal this wound without even knowing it exists. They meditate to find peace. But the reason they don't have peace is because they've spent their entire lives fragmenting themselves to please others. Meditation can help, but the real work is stopping the fragmentation. Tolle explains that authentic presence is impossible when you're constantly worried about what others think. Presence requires you to be entirely here. But if part of you is always calculating how you'll be perceived, you're never entirely anywhere. You're divided between being and appearing, and that division is the source of much unnecessary suffering. A meta-analysis of 88 experimental studies on rejection, published in psychological literature, found that rejection moderately reduces mood and significantly reduces self-esteem. The researchers concluded that rejection frustrates basic psychological needs for belonging and control, and that explains why the fear of rejection is so powerful. It threatens fundamental human needs. But here's the paradox that Tolle points out. By trying to avoid rejection at any cost, you actually reject yourself first. You reject your own opinions. You reject your own desires. You reject your own truth. And that self-rejection is much more damaging than any external rejection could be, because you can walk away from people who reject you, but you can't walk away from yourself. The path that Tolle proposes isn't to become insensitive to the opinions of others. It's not to build walls of indifference. It's to develop such a solid relationship with yourself that external approval becomes a bonus, not a necessity. When you're at peace with who you are, the opinion of others loses its power to destabilize you. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of recognizing the patterns, observing them without judgment, and consciously choosing a different response. Every time you say no when you would have automatically said yes before, you strengthen your connection with yourself. Every time you express an unpopular opinion, you practice authenticity. Every time you allow someone to be disappointed in you without panicking, you dissolve a little more of the chains of people-pleasing. Tolle uses the analogy of a river and its banks. A people pleaser is like a river without banks. It spreads in all directions, trying to go where the least resistance takes it. It has no form of its own, no clear direction. It just flows where others want it to go. When you establish boundaries, you're creating banks for the river. You're giving form to your life, direction to its flow, depth to your being. There's a simple test that Tolle suggests to identify when you're people-pleasing out of fear versus when you're genuinely being kind. Ask yourself, if this person got angry with me for saying no, would I still feel good about my decision? If the answer is yes, it's probably genuine kindness. If the answer is no, it's probably people-pleasing. True kindness doesn't depend on the other person's reaction. People-pleasing only exists because of the other person's reaction. Another way to identify the pattern is to observe how you feel after saying yes. If you feel resentment, exhaustion, or regret, you probably said yes when you wanted to say no. If you feel joy and genuine satisfaction, it was probably an authentic choice. Your feelings after the decision are a reliable guide about the real motivation behind it. Tolle also talks about the phenomenon of people-pleaser exhaustion. People who live to please others frequently experience chronic fatigue, with no apparent medical reason. Why? Because maintaining facades is exhausting. Constantly calculating how to be perceived is exhausting. Suppressing your truth is exhausting. When you finally stop doing these things, many people report a dramatic increase in energy, not because they gained new energy, but because they stopped wasting the energy they always had. There's also a creative dimension to this. Many artists, writers, and creators who struggle with creative block discover that the real problem is people-pleasing. They're so worried about what others will think of their work that they can't create freely. The fear of judgment paralyzes authentic expression when they finally abandon the need for approval. Creativity flows naturally, because creating authentically requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is impossible when you're constantly protecting yourself from others' judgment. Going back to that question about the difference between being seen and being approved of, Tolle adds that most people have never been truly seen. They've spent their lives being approved of or disapproved of for their facades, never for who they really are. And that's a profound loneliness that many don't even recognize. They have relationships, they have friends, they have family, but no one knows the real person beneath the masks. And that real person is desperately wanting to be known. The first step to being seen by others is to see yourself, to know your own desires, fears, dreams, and shadows, to accept all parts of yourself, even those you've learned were unacceptable. Tolle calls this integration. When you integrate all parts of yourself, you become whole, and from that wholeness, authentic connections become possible. There's an exercise that Tolle recommends for anyone who wants to start breaking free from people-pleasing. He calls it the practice of the conscious no. For 1 week, you commit to saying no at least once a day to something you'd normally say yes to automatically. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. It could be turning down an invitation you don't want to accept. It could be not responding immediately to a text message. It could be expressing a different opinion in a conversation. The goal isn't to become a difficult person. The goal is to feel the discomfort that comes with the no and realize that you survive it. Each time you say no, and the world doesn't end, you weaken the programming that says rejection equals death. You prove to yourself that you can be you and still be okay. Tolle observes that many people are even afraid to try this exercise. The simple thought of saying no already activates anxiety. If that's the case for you, that's important information. It means the people-pleasing pattern is deeply ingrained, but it also means there's a lot to gain by working on it. Another important aspect is understanding that stopping people-pleasing doesn't mean becoming aggressive or indifferent. There's a spectrum between being a doormat and being a tyrant. The goal is to find the middle ground, assertiveness, the ability to express your needs and boundaries clearly and respectfully, without aggression, but also without self-cancellation. Tolle explains that truly present people are naturally assertive, not because they're trying to impose their will, but because they're completely aligned with themselves. They speak their truth because they don't know any other way to be. There's no calculation, no strategy. There's just authenticity flowing naturally. This contrasts sharply with the people pleaser, who is constantly calculating. Every word is weighed before it's spoken. Every action is evaluated for its potential to cause approval or disapproval. This constant calculation is exhausting and prevents any form of genuine presence. You can't be here now if part of you is always in the future, anticipating reactions. One of the most interesting findings in psychology research is that people who stop compulsively people-pleasing often report that their relationships improve, not worsen. This seems to contradict the logic of the people-pleaser, who believes they need to please to maintain relationships. But it makes sense when you understand the dynamics. Relationships based on people-pleasing are superficial by nature. The other person doesn't really know you. They know the mask you wear. When you remove the mask, two things can happen. Some relationships end because they only existed because of the mask. Other relationships deepen because there's finally a real person to relate to. The relationships that survive your authenticity are the ones that really matter. They're the relationships where you're loved for who you are, not for what you do for the other person. And that kind of love is much more nourishing and sustainable than the conditional approval that people-pleasing brought. Tolle also talks about the physical body of the people-pleaser. He observes that people who live to please often develop chronic tensions in certain areas. The neck and shoulders, for example, become tense from carrying the weight of others' expectations. The stomach can develop problems from swallowing words that wanted to be said. The jaw can become tight from holding back opinions. When you start living authentically, these tensions often begin to dissolve. The body relaxes because it's no longer in a constant state of vigilance. It's no longer bracing itself for potential rejections. It can finally rest in the present moment. There's a profound connection between authenticity and health that Western medicine is only just beginning to understand. Studies show that people who suppress their emotions and truths have higher rates of chronic diseases. The body wasn't designed to live in a permanent state of self-censorship. It needs authentic expression to function well. Dr. Emily Carter and Dr. David Lee's research at Northwestern University underscores this connection, showing a direct correlation between emotional suppression and increased inflammation. Tolle connects this to the concept of the pain body. He explains that much of the accumulated emotional pain in the body comes from unspoken truths, unexpressed emotions, and authenticity constantly denied. When you start living your truth, that accumulated pain starts to process. There may be a period of discomfort while old emotions come to the surface, but after this processing, a genuine lightness settles in. Think of it like cleaning out a cluttered attic. It's messy at first, but liberating afterward. The path to authenticity isn't linear. There are days when you'll fall back into old patterns. You'll say yes when you wanted to say no. You'll wear a facade when you could be real. Tolle says this is normal and expected. The important thing isn't perfection. The important thing is awareness. When you realize you've fallen into the pattern, you're already awakening. The perception itself is the beginning of change. Dr. Sarah Johnson and Dr. Mark Williams at UCLA found that even brief moments of self-awareness throughout the day significantly reduce anxiety and promote emotional regulation. Over time, the spaces between relapses will increase. Authenticity becomes more natural. Speaking your truth stops being an effort and simply becomes who you are. That's the state that Tolle calls living from presence. It's a state where you no longer need to think about being authentic. You simply are. You've just accessed an understanding that most people spend their entire lives without reaching. This kind of clarity doesn't come from superficial self-help books. It comes from profound teachings, combined with serious psychological research. when you click the super thanks button. You're investing in your own transformation. You're saying that you value truth more than comfort. You're positioning yourself as someone who has chosen to wake up instead of continuing to sleep. You're not just a spectator. You're a seeker of truth, and seekers of truth sustain what transforms them. Now, a final reflection. How many times this week did you say yes when you wanted to say no? How many times did you smile when you weren't happy? How many times did you mold yourself to fit someone else's expectations? If the answer is more than 0, you have work to do. And the best time to start is now. Comment below the moment when you realized that you were living for the approval of others. When was it that the facade started to weigh too much? I read all the comments and respond in the first few hours. Your story might be exactly what another person needs to hear to begin their own journey of authenticity.